Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 drama. Max Verstappen has responded to his collisions with Lewis Hamilton over the last couple of years, stating he doesn't know why every time he's up against Hamilton, things go differently in terms of his on-track action compared to other rivals. Does he have a point here, or is his logic deeply flawed? Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. So Verstappen had a dominant season, won the championship, no problems at all. Maybe he'll do it again, that remains to be seen. But we know that this season, the racing was relatively clean for Verstappen against most drivers until at the end of the year there was that one incident with Hamilton back at Brazil where all of a sudden they come together, there's damage on both sides, kind of ruins Verstappen's race and it ruins Hamilton's race as well in terms of fighting for the victory that time. Now Hamilton responded to this at the time and said hey, he can understand why Verstappen views him as a target, and that's why he feels like he is a target of Verstappen, because Hamilton's, he's the old guy, he's the 7-time world champion, he's the man to beat, and Hamilton felt the same way about other drivers when he joined the grid and was like, yeah, I want to beat those guys, I want to show that I'm here to say I'm the guy to beat now, effectively was what Hamilton thought, let's say 15 years ago when he joined the sport, and he understands why Verstappen might feel the same way to him at the moment, but also, pretty frustrated that Verstappen seems to treat him differently than other drivers. Now, Verstappen doesn't agree, and he reckons it's basically Hamilton's fault, and says, I don't understand, maybe it's a generation thing, stating that his racing with all the other drivers, which in fairness is true this past season, was pretty much clean across the board, but as soon as he's racing Hamilton, then there's a collision. Now, is this Hamilton's fault? Is this Verstappen's fault? I'm sure, well, you guys might have your opinion in the comment section below, but I'll give some kind of context to this over the coming minutes. So these are, in an exclusive interview, these are his words, stating that, is his driving style described as uncompromising? Is that fair? And he says, look, I have to be careful with what I'm saying here, but with everyone I've been fighting this year, it's been really hard, aggressive battles, and we never really came together. Somehow with Lewis, it's always a different story. I honestly don't understand. This year, okay, we haven't really had a lot of battles, but in Brazil we got together. It was not my intention that we crashed. Now, might have to dispute that one here in a second. I got the blame for it, which I didn't find fair. He got the penalty or whatever. He had to pit for the new front wing. His race was kind of over at that point, but he still held on to that P6, whatever it was, over Sergio Perez. It would have been more of a racing incident. If it would have been more of a racing incident, I could have lived with that, but I don't understand. Maybe it's a generation thing that we understand each other better. We are racing nicer to each other. I just don't really understand it. And then he goes on to say this, when I was fighting George at that same race, the sprint weekends, we were having an incredible fight, closing the door, defending, outbreaking each other, lots of fun, and we saw Verstappen, with Leclerc have some great battles. In fairness, Verstappen had some questionable moves, like on Norris back in Singapore, right, when he obviously outbraked himself, went off into the runoff area. That was a lot of fun with George, that battle, and I was trying to do the same in the main race, having that kind of battle maybe with Hamilton in this case, but it wasn't going to work. And he also says that he needs to be careful here, because when he discusses Hamilton, this can be received in England as criticism, and then I'm being called out on it, which maybe for good reason. I also respect Lewis a lot for what he's achieved in the sport, but everyone has their own approach. I know Charles a bit different to George, etc. But, still, people start to hate on you. That is not my intention. So those were Verstappen's words. Now, must say on these things about the fact that he never intended to collide, it's slightly different wording now that Verstappen's using and backtracking a bit compared to what he said at the time. This was his quote, an actual quote, by the way, straight after the race back in Brazil. I went around the outside and immediately felt that he wasn't going to leave the space, so I just went for it. I knew that we were going to get together. It cost him the race win, and it gave me 5 seconds. It wouldn't have mattered anything for my race. So, yeah, look, these were words from Verstappen right after the race. It was obviously a controversial one for other instances with the Perez stuff, but nonetheless, he basically admitted, at least, you can't really read this and say that he didn't, at least in part, cause this collision on purpose. So it seems to me that both Hamilton and Verstappen do drive differently when they are next to each other. Verstappen was very clean for the majority of this past season, up against George Russell, up against Charles Leclerc. As soon as he's up against Hamilton, though, it does feel like a different story. Maybe the other way around as well, and maybe for understandable reasons. This incident, of course, was deemed Verstappen's fault. I think for understandable reasons, because, going into this turn 2, Hamilton was ahead going into this corner. Like, Verstappen wasn't going to be able to make this move happen and keep Lewis Hamilton and himself both on the track with the speed he was taking. So I can understand in this case why it was given as a penalty for Max. I also thought a racing incident wouldn't have been completely inappropriate, but nonetheless, their first real race to, wheel-to-wheel racing of the season. There was a couple of examples before this, of course, in Austin and in, Netherlands and stuff like that as well, but, usually Verstappen always had a massive pace advantage there. This was for position, right, and when the Mercedes was actually stronger than the Red Bull on this particular weekend. So whether you think that was Verstappen's fault, whether you think that was Hamilton's fault, I think certainly over the last year or so, there's been many examples of when Verstappen has been, let's just say say, driving rather differently when Hamilton is there compared to when another driver is there. This, of course, Brazil 2021, when he just drove Hamilton completely off the roads. This was in Jeddah, which is probably Verstappen's worst race of the season, really. This was here in turn 1. They go into turn 1. Verstappen completely cuts the corner, outbrakes himself, and still gets back on the track at this angle and forces Hamilton off as well. And then, of course, later in the race, there was this incident with a whole brake test drama. So, look, I do think that it's not just Hamilton, right? I think that maybe he's right to a certain extent that Hamilton maybe drives differently around Verstappen, but Verstappen is definitely driving differently around Hamilton, I think. I'm not sure he would have gone for this move if it would have been a Leclerc or someone else. I'm not sure he would have done it, but I do think there is some sort of, something going on between these two drivers where this stuff always happens. But it's also the other way around, right? Of course, this was at Silverstone 2021, where Hamilton just did not yield, and we've already seen this in the past many times. I mean, Brundle's talked about this even of Ayrton Senna, who said that what Ayrton Senna would do is he'd put the car in a position where if you wanted to take the corner as intended, you would crash and you'd be out of the race. But then if you did back out and left Senna the space, then he would have you psychologically. He'd be in your head. He would know that whenever he put himself in that spot, you would back down. So at some point, you've got to say, you know what, I'm not taking this, and I'm just going to put my car there, and if we want to collide, we can collide. And this might be what Hamilton was doing to Silverstone to some degree. He was like, look, I'm not going to yield every single time, because Hamilton's usually a driver that takes the whole, to finish first you've got to finish approach, and in order to do that, often you've got to be more careful, back out of situations to ensure you survive. But I do think there's been some element of Hamilton that he's like, look, Verstappen's got away with a lot against me the last couple of years or so. At some point, you've got to put your foot down and say, I'm not having it anymore, and I'm not going to yield every time you want to make the move happen. I think that's part of what happened at Silverstone, and of course, well, Verstappen was out of the race and thankfully was okay, and it might have been also in part of what happened here. I do wonder if this incident had been at the start of 2021, I think Hamilton might have said, okay, you know what, Verstappen, make the crazy move, I'll back out of it and live to fight another day. But it happened at the end of 2022, when obviously Hamilton was out of the championship fight anyway. So I can understand Hamilton's motivation to be like, look, I'm not backing out, I'm not yielding, I'm going to show Verstappen that I'm not going to let him get away with some of these moves, even though Verstappen might still try and pull them off against Hamilton, arguably, whether that's for because there's a target reasoning that Hamilton believes or whatever. So tweet your thoughts in the comment section below on this one. It's always a tricky one, right? Because Verstappen is basically piling the blame on Hamilton and saying it's his fault because everyone else that Verstappen races, he can race fine with, and Hamilton he can't, which, maybe there's some truth to that, but I don't think it's just because, of Hamilton. I think that there's also elements of which Verstappen drives differently against him, maybe because, it still feels like Hamilton's kind of the guy to beat. And I think to an extent, understandably so, in terms of who the top drivers are going into next season. If they had equal machinery, I'd still take a Hamilton versus Verstappen fight for the title to be the most likely, but of course we'll see what the cars turn out to be next season. So definitely tweet your thoughts in the comment section below on that one. And just a couple of things to close out with, because certainly something that I do agree with Verstappen on is sprint races, and Pierre Gasly agrees as well. He says, I can see the positive aspects for sprint races from a financial perspective, but in terms of a spectacle, however, they have not yet shown it is worthwhile to double them in 23. We know there are going to be 6 sprint races next year, not just 3. That's a big difference as far as I'm concerned, and Gasly has made it very clear that he's not a big fan of them, neither are the majority of the drivers. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you are new, take care, and I'll see you next time.